If you want to learn more about the topics of today's episode, visit the podcast website at naturesecretservice.com. Thanks for listening. Okay, people, listen up. Here we go. This is Nature's Secret Service, the podcast that puts you in the room with the men and women of wildlife law enforcement. I'm Ed Newcomer, your host, and we are continuing with Season 3 in our deep dive on wolves in the United States and their return to the wild. And it's time we start talking about Mexican gray wolves, because a lot of what we've talked about so far has been the wolves that were released in Yellowstone and the Yellowstone ecosystem up there in 1995, the northern gray wolves, and now it's time to focus on the Mexican wolves. Joining us today is a fantastic guest, Sherry Barrett. I've known Sherry for a long time. She was a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and, has been involved in the protection and recovery of endangered and threatened species throughout the Southwestern United States for 3 decades. She has worked on multi-species conservation plans in Southern California, desert conservation plans in the Southwest, dealing with everything from, desert tortoises to Mexican gray wolves. And in fact, from 2011 until she retired in 2018, she was the recovery coordinator for the Mexican gray wolf program, which, I could have her talk about it, but we want to jump into the meat of our conversation today. But basically, as the director of that program, she was responsible for all of it. Field activities, the captive breeding program, development of the endangered species policies around Mexican wolves. And now, even in retirement, she's still involved, volunteering her time to help with the recovery of Mexican wolves. In fact, before we came on air, she just told me that just yesterday she was out helping to capture a Mexican gray wolf. So, Sherry, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on. I think you're such a valuable part of the story we're trying to tell in Season 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and great to see you again. I think it's been many years since I saw you. We went through some programs together in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we stayed in touch for a long time. And it's been a while, though, since we actually saw each other in person. So great to see you today.
Yeah, good to see you, too.
Can you tell us, we're really launching now into a discussion about the Mexican gray wolves. Can you just tell us, first of all, a little bit about Mexican gray wolves versus what's up in the northern part of the U.S., the northern gray wolf?
So Mexican gray wolves are a subspecies of the northern gray wolf. And so they're genetically unique. They're a smaller animal. They're golden retriever size, 50 to 80 pounds, whereas those in the northern gray wolf population, they're easily 100 pounds or more. And so it's a smaller animal, and they don't come in all gray or all black colors. They're gray. Sometimes a little bit of cinnamon in there.
Interesting. Okay. So like if you were to see one in the wild next to a northern gray wolf, would you know instantly, I'm looking at a different species or different animal?
It would depend on if that was a smaller northern, or younger
Got it.
northern gray wolf. So, and then the range of the Mexican wolf was kind of central Mexico, north into southern New Mexico, southeastern Arizona, and then into western Texas.
Okay, yeah, that was my next question. What was kind of the history of the Mexican gray wolf? What was its range in the U.S. and why do we need a reintroduction program for the Mexican gray wolf? So what's their history? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the history of the Mexican gray wolf is pretty bleak. It back in the mid to late 1800s, there was extensive livestock grazing in Southwestern United States and Mexico. Going from numbers of livestock in the tens of thousands up in just maybe a couple of decades to over 1 million. And so it was extensive. It caused a lot of erosion, but it also depleted the native animals, the prey base for Mexican wolves. And so they did turn to some livestock depredation, and that triggered a really hard effort to remove predators from the wild. These were often not only bounties, but also federal employees that were hired or people that were contracted to go down. And they targeted bears, wolves, cougars, coyotes. And so by the mid 1900s, Mexican wolves were pretty much eradicated from the United States.
Okay.
There were still a few in Mexico. And so things changed, mindsets of people in the United States changed over time. And in the 60s, there was the Starker-Leopold report that really criticized the federal policies for getting rid of predators.
Right.
And other things happened, in the 1970s. That was under President Nixon. We got the Environmental Protection Agency, and also signed into law the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, and importantly for this, the Endangered Species Act.
Right.
And so all of that was a major mindset change from those massive predator elimination policies previously moving forward. And so in about 1977, the Fish and Wildlife Service hired Roy McBride, who was previously a federal predator trapper, involved in killing off some of these predators.
Right.
But they hired him to go down into Mexico and trap some of the last remaining Mexican wolves in the wild. And he brought back, over 3 years, 77 to 80s, he brought back 5 animals. And from those 5, there were 3 founders. And that's just because some of them were related. One was a pregnant female also. And so they actually never trapped her mate, but he was a founder because the offspring. So it's a little complicated there, but 3 of those animals. And then they found 4 more later on in captive populations that were determined by genetics to be pure Mexican wolves.
Interesting.
So those 7 animals became the founding population for all Mexican wolves now.
Wow. So when you say founders in that first group, that first 5 that were captured in the wild down in Mexico, when you say founders, what does that mean exactly? I'm not really sure what that means.
Well, it means that those are the animals from which all the genetics are derived into the current population.
I see.
So they started and were mating breeding those together to create a captive population. So what you did basically was you took 7 animals and you had to grow a captive population first.
Right.
And so from those, then you could eventually release into the wild. But first you had to have a population in the captive breeding program that was sustainable.
Okay.
And so right now there's still a captive breeding program, and there's about 350 Mexican wolves in about 60 facilities in the United States and Mexico.
And these facilities, what are they? Are they zoos? Is that what I'm assuming? AZA?
Some are,
zoos?
yes. Most of them are zoos, and some are they're wolf breeding facilities.
Okay. And was that part of something you were responsible for kind of coordinating and overseeing as the recovery coordinator?
It was under my purview. I had an excellent staff.
Yeah, of course.
Who had been working with these facilities for many years, and she was the one that worked directly with them.
Okay.
So they coordinate, and it's under the auspices of the American Aquarium and Zoos Association.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so they have a program for individual endangered animals, and from that they have it's a computer stud book. And they know which animals need to be bred each year to maintain the genetic diversity as much as possible.
Yeah.
So with only 7 founders, you're not going to increase that genetic diversity unless you find a new animal, which, we know we won't now.
Right.
It's been too many years. But you can maintain as much as possible. And that's one of the goals of the recovery program, is to maintain that genetic diversity to the extent you can. You will always lose some each year, some percent. So.
Yeah, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service has had a similar problem, or not problem, but we'll call it a challenge, with other species that were almost completely extinct, like the black-footed ferret and I think even the California condor. They've had to really juggle the genetics to make sure that they don't end up with negative consequences from inbreeding, right?
Correct. All of those. Yeah.
Must be a huge challenge to do that, especially. I assume computerization has helped, but can you imagine like in the 70s and 80s trying to sort this out with no computers, and you're trying to keep all this straight?
Right.
Must have been crazy.
It would be more challenging. And the other thing that happens each year then is you're transferring these animals among these 60 different facilities.
Right.
And, it's a lot of work. It's because some of them are all the way in New York, St. Louis, state of Washington, down here in Arizona and New Mexico. There are several different locations. And so we also are benefited by the Lighthawk, which is a group of volunteer pilots.
Oh, cool.
Who use their own planes, and they help transport these animals around, which is really great. And sometimes, although it's just a very long drive in a van with wolves in the back.
Right, right. And I'm sure that could add, that could blow your budget pretty fast if you were trying to move, fly animals around just to maintain the genetics. Your recovery budget could get blown through pretty quickly, I assume, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so volunteers like that are very helpful. I want to back up just for a second, because I don't think we can stress enough, and of course in other episodes we've talked about this too in this season, this all-out assault on predators in the Western United States, like you said, starting in the late 1800s. And just for background, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the earliest, as the United States was starting to move into beef production, the cowboy culture really got started because this cattle, as you mentioned, these cattle ranches and these cattle operations that were operating in the Southwest, throughout, Texas and the Southwest and Mexico. Once a year, twice a year, they would have they'd move their cattle in huge drives up to cities like Dodge City, the classic, frontier towns where all these lawmen got their names, dealing with rowdy cowboys that were coming up from the Southwest, right? And so, like you said, a lot of environmental damage caused by just that many hoofed animals moving, very different than bison. And along the way, cowboys were killing every predator they could find because they didn't want their calves hit. And this then morphed into the actual government policy to eliminate predators: cougars, coyotes, foxes, badgers, anything that would prey, eagles, anything that would prey on a calf or a cow would be a target for this operation. And that included wolves. Do you know, I think the last recorded gray wolf was killed in Yellowstone in 1926, I believe. Do you know when the last Mexican gray wolf was known to be roaming around the wild?
Well, it would have been with Roy McBride, and so it would have been down towards Durango.
Okay, but Mexico. What about
in the 80s?
What about in the United States?
In the United States, it was around mid 1900s, about 1950.
Okay, yeah, I think Aldo Leopold even documented. I can't remember what year he's kind of famously documented himself as killing a wolf once, and I believe that was in New Mexico. I think it was a northern gray wolf, and he regretted that later in his career. But and I think that was after 1926. I can't remember exactly, but between 1920 and 1940, pretty much the last wolves in the United States were gone. I mean, they were eliminated. And
they were pretty effective with gassing pups, poisoning, trapping, hunting, everything. So,
how does coyotes are kind of famous for responding with larger litters under pressure, right? So the more pressure you put on coyotes, the more coyotes they produce. I assume is that not true for wolves, or how do they, if they're under pressure to the?
No, wolves are pretty susceptible to, especially poison, and they only breed once a year.
I see.
Coyotes, I believe, can breed more than once a year if necessary as well.
Gotcha. And I'm going to jump ahead to something I was going to talk about later, because you told me about this, and I didn't know this before. But gray wolves, meaning the northern gray wolf and the Mexican gray wolf, I think a myth out there among anti-wolf people and ranchers is that they will interbreed with coyotes. And you told me that's not true.
And they don't.
They don't.
No, and Mexican wolves, every animal that's ever captured or encountered, there's blood drawn. And so they run genetics on every Mexican wolf that's ever in hand. And there's never been any incident of coyote genes in those wolves.
Okay.
But from that blood DNA test, they can also figure out parentage. So that's also helpful in figuring out genetic diversity, et cetera, in the wild.
Yeah. So modern science has really solved that question forever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So now after this capture, there's been captive breeding. At some point, Fish and Wildlife Service and the states get to a point where they think there's enough wolves that they can release into the wild. What was the first year that the Mexican gray wolf was returned to wild places?
It was 1998,
okay.
And it was under President Clinton and Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt.
Okay.
And Secretary Babbitt was very, very interested in returning Mexican gray wolves and other wolves as well to the wild to address the sins of the past. And so they released 2 families of Mexican wolves into Forest Service lands in Arizona. And remarkably, those wolves had never been in the wild. They came from captivity. They were reared in captivity, but their instincts for the prey drive became almost instant, and they were killing elk.
No kidding.
And in fact, down in Mexico, there aren't elk. Well, there's some private herds now, but Mexican wolves, especially down in Mexico, did not evolve with elk.
I see.
And so they more with white-tailed deer.
I see.
And javelina. And so the people weren't really sure what the smaller Mexican gray wolf was going to prey on. But in fact, it is elk.
That's interesting.
80% of their diet is elk. And a lot of that's during when elk calve.
Right.
They do go after elk calves, and also gut piles during the hunting season in the fall.
Right.
So that's part of their elk diet. But they also can, a pack of wolves can take down an adult.
Interesting. So they're primarily evolved around deer, but presumably some elk as well. But they even the ones raised in captivity quickly adapted to killing large ungulates, huh?
Yes.
That's interesting. And of course, that's going to raise red flags with every hunter who's going to try to claim that these wolves destroy elk populations. We're going to jump around a little bit here, but you were the coordinator from 2011 to 2018, so that's 7 years, give or take. And, obviously been in the service much longer. What's your experience with the Mexican gray wolf's impact on elk populations in Arizona and New Mexico? So
the elk populations are actually monitored and managed by the state game departments, both in New Mexico and Arizona. And they monitor individual populations, and they're showing that the elk populations are stable or increasing in both states. So that's a good thing. But hunters will say that elk are not in the places that they used to find them.
Right.
And that's probably true, because elk, if left alone, they will just stay in meadows and riparian ecosystems where they find a lot of good browse, and that can be very detrimental to those ecosystems. So elk move them around, make them go to different places, and I'm sure that does seem like there's fewer elk than where hunters used to find them.
Yep. Absolutely. And this is something that has always kind of befuddled me about the hunters who claim that the wolves are depleting the elk and deer populations, because not just in New Mexico and Arizona, but Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, the numbers, the counts every year and the number of deer taken by hunters, et cetera, do not support that conclusion. And anybody who hunts or enjoys the outdoors, it just doesn't take that much brain power to understand that, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, even before wolves were growing in numbers, if you went out, you'd see large herds of elk hanging out in a meadow, just pretty unconcerned with everything. Pretty easy to shoot them, pretty easy to stalk them and hunt them and shoot them. Now wolves are causing them to disperse. They have to stay on the move. And so, of course, me with my binoculars, you with your rifle, somebody else with their bow and arrow, they're not seeing as much elk as they used to because the elk are moving. So this is what gets me is it's the fact that you don't see as many elk doesn't necessarily mean they aren't there. It's just something's changed and it's movement. So to me, it's like, this rumor has gone around that pretty much started with probably two guys at a bar drinking a beer, talking about hunting and how they don't see as many elk as they used to 20 years ago. And somehow that morphed into, that must be because the wolves are killing them all, which doesn't follow, right? Anyway, I think it's interesting because it's part of the other side of the biological discussion, because there is another very valid argument that's probably true that the elk are actually benefited by having these predators in their environment in terms of healthier herds, right?
Healthier, stronger herds. Exactly.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because how many wolves were released in the Mexican gray wolves in 1998? It was how many?
Well, there was two families. So
small.
And just to clarify that a pack is two breeding adults, their offspring usually from a year before or so, and then pups of the year. Okay. So that not large. That first year, how many you think we would have been talking about released? Less than 10 for sure, right? Yeah, I think there was maybe, I think it was 5 to 7 per pack.
Okay.
And there was 2 packs released.
Okay, so maybe 10 to 14.
About 14 animals, I think. Yeah.
And now, that was 1998. Now, how many Mexican wolves are estimated to be running loose in New Mexico and Arizona?
Well, so the interesting thing with wolves is it's not an estimate, it's actual count. And they do a count once a year in January, February, and that's for the previous year. So January, February of 26 tells you what wolves were alive through December 31st of 2025.
I see. Okay.
And so they do it based on camera traps and sightings, and then also generally from helicopter and fixed wing.
Okay.
Because the goal is to have at least one radio collar per pack. And then you can find that pack and then count the individuals, especially from the air, to find out how many are out there.
So what is the number?
It gets harder as the population gets larger.
Sure, of course. What was the number in most recent count?
319.
319. So gone from 14 animals to 319 wolves, and still the elk populations are stable and or growing.
Correct.
Do you know if that is also true of deer populations in those two states?
I don't know. I don't know the statistics on the deer.
Okay. What's the primary prey species of the Mexican gray wolves currently in New Mexico and Arizona? Is it primarily deer or is it primarily elk, or do you know?
Elk. 80% of their diet is elk.
Interesting. Okay. So can you explain, I think a lot of people like myself, before I personally visited it years ago, actually, do you know when I visited Northern Arizona for the first time, it was when you and I were going through the Advanced Leadership Development Program.
Okay.
I did part of my detail at one of the field offices there in Phoenix, and on a long weekend, I went up to Northern Arizona.
Oh, yeah.
I was surprised at the habitat up there. Can you just describe what the habitat's like where these wolves are? I think a lot of times people assume it's very deserty and cactus everywhere, but that's not necessarily true, is it, for that part of the world?
No, and in fact, the wolves really aren't in the deserts. They are in the forest. Alpine, Arizona is this is where the field office is out in the group that manages the animals in the wild. And but they're in the forested areas.
Yeah, and it can be very heavily forested up in those areas. I was surprised.
Correct.
Yeah. I was also surprised at how big the elk are up there. I saw a few bull elk while I was there, and having grown up in Colorado, I'm used to seeing big bull elk, but I was shocked how big the elk are there in Alpine, Arizona area.
Yeah, and those have also recovered because the Merriam's elk were eliminated in Arizona and then reestablished with some elk from north. So they've also done well. They're doing very well right now.
Yeah, and that reminds me too of, you mentioned that another contributor to the loss of the Mexican gray wolf in the late 1800s, early 1900s was depletion of the prey species, deer and elk. And, in a previous episode on this podcast, we talked with Mark Madison at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's the historian. He talked a lot about the impact of market hunting in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And for anybody listening or watching this podcast, you really have to put yourself in the place in America at that time. And deer and elk, ducks, wild animals were being slaughtered like in unsustainable numbers just to supply the restaurant market on the East Coast and Chicago area. And elk and deer were part of that. It was as we were transitioning to a, industrial beef-based, meat supply system. A lot of the meat that was showing up in restaurants around the country was wild game, and it was having a dramatic impact, not just on the species, but other species. Like you start to take the elk and the deer out, it affects the wolves that are preying on them.
Right.
And of course, they're going to turn to whatever's available. And what's walking around at the time were cattle. Lots of them. Which now brings me to the next question. In your experience with the wolf recovery program, we talked now a little bit about their impact on deer and elk. In your experience, what was their impact on domestic cattle and sheep in the Arizona, New Mexico area?
Yeah, so they do definitely prey on and depredate cattle and livestock. There are fewer sheep operations now than there used to be in Arizona and New Mexico, mostly cattle.
Okay.
And so that is a major management focus of the interagency field team, which is comprised of both state game agencies, White Mountain Apache Tribe, Forest Service, Wildlife Services, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And jointly, those agencies all work to minimize those depredations on livestock.
Okay.
And some of the most effective is human presence. And so they hire range riders to have that presence. But there's also, wolves are really afraid of flapping flags.
No kidding.
Fladry. So in small areas, you can use fladry. But of course, you're not going to be able to use that on very large areas of livestock operations.
Right.
But there's loud noises, just different techniques that they deploy to help the ranchers. And then there's also, of course, depredation compensation. And so the Wildlife Services, often confused with Fish and Wildlife Service, but Wildlife Services is Department of Agriculture. And they'll go out and determine whether or not a cow has been, or any kind of cattle have been depredated by a wolf or by something else.
I see.
And because wolves also will scavenge. And so it could have died from something else, and the wolf is nearby or has the print nearby because they do scavenge. Yeah. But they can determine that by if the bite has hemorrhaging underneath it, that means the animal was alive when that bite occurred.
Right.
But anyways, based on that, then these livestock operators can be compensated for the cost of that animal.
I see. Okay.
And there's programs now in both Arizona and New Mexico that are set up for that.
And that's another good point to remember is that a lot of these cattle are run on U.S. government leases on U.S. Forest Service property, right? So I remember this growing up in Colorado. You go hiking in the forest, any of the national forests in Colorado, and it's pretty likely you're going to run into some sheep or some cows. And it's because the U.S. Forest Service leases their property to ranchers. And basically the ranchers in the spring, they just let their cattle go. And they roam around all summer getting fat on federally owned grass. But they're, historically they just let them go because there weren't predators out there. So they didn't need range riders and they didn't need all these things in the past. But they're getting the benefit of really cheap leases on federal land and running their cattle in pretty wild areas. So yeah, they're running into cougars and wolves and things like that, bears as they would. How, as the coordinator, certainly you had to kind of work with stakeholders and local landowners and ranchers, right? Yeah. How did you balance?
We spend a lot.
I bet you did. What kind of things did you do to kind of build relationships with those people and stay informed about what their concerns were and inform them about what the goals were and what the realities were for wolf reintroduction? What was that like?
Yeah, with a lot of meetings in ranchers' homes and stuff, and they're good people. It's and it's a small business for the most part. There are corporate ranchers out there, but they're good people, and for the most part, and an extra predator on the land is going to affect their bottom line. And so that's why, we worked hard to find some programs that would help them. And we did put together a council when I first came on that brought together some environmental groups, ranchers, some of the White Mountain Apache tribe, and tried to come up with some of these programs, what would really be beneficial to them, not us telling them what it would be, but them telling us what would help them. And that's where we came to depredation compensation, of course, but then also payments for presence. So there is a program in New Mexico now. I'm not sure there is one in Arizona right now, but recognizing that if livestock are run more by wolves, then they're going to lose weight.
Right.
And it's also true that they don't find all of the carcasses. So they don't find all the animals that have been depredated. So the payments for presence is trying to offset some of those additional issues that they experience with another predator on the land. And then there's also programs for them to help with funding for like range riders or other programs to try and deter the depredations.
What do you think among the landowners and ranchers, and hunters, what's the number one misperception or misperception among their ideas about wolves and their interaction with cattle or the environment?
Well, we hear a lot that wolves kill for fun.
Right.
Which they don't.
Yeah.
Wolves are killing to eat and feed their offspring.
It's interesting, there's probably lots of things you run into, but if you're trying to think of something else or another one, while I was kind of preparing for this season, I just kind of snooped around on public records that are available online from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And they keep pretty specific data about the causes of death of domestic cattle in this country, sheep and cattle. And for both sheep and cattle, the number one cause of death is respiratory disease. And it's like over 90% is respiratory disease. And that's cattle that are roaming around, loose all summer. They're not monitored. They're not medicated for anything. They're just, living pretty much like a wild domestic animal, a feral cow out there in the wild. And they come down with diseases. They have injuries. That's the primary.
There's poisonous. There's local weed out there. There's poisonous plants, and bears actually take a lot of calves, and feral dogs do too. So the real interesting numbers, the USDA numbers up in Wyoming and Idaho and Montana specifically address bear depredation, and they don't divide it into black bear or grizzly bear. They just say bears.
And it's there, but it's usually around 2-3% of the deaths are caused by bears. And but then you look at the other causes, and it's like 90% is respiratory disease, and then there's others in there that still outstrip what bears and predators cause. Even coyotes don't cause that much damage to calves, but it's kind of interesting. If anybody is interested in that kind of thing, because that to me is a number one misperception that I hear a lot from people who are anti-wolf. And all I have to say is just spend 20 minutes, go to the USDA website and start snooping around in old historical data. It goes back to the 90s before wolves were even reintroduced. It's not hard to look at what's causing cattle death in on public land. Anyway, interesting. Okay, so the killing for fun. Yeah, I've heard that one too, but that's not true, huh?
No.
Okay.
Animals in general don't expend energy that they don't need to expend.
Yes. Now,
because it's survival.
The reverse of that, you're working with stakeholders, you're having these meetings. Is there anything like, I assume there are some ranchers out there who are not anti-wolf. Did you ever run into people who kind of got sold on the idea or supportive of the program?
Yeah, definitely. And they are, they're very helpful because they're willing to try a lot of these new techniques that may come around and deploy them on their landscape. And, and work closely with the field team. Right. That's really key, is to have the ranchers call the field team when there's a problem and the field team will help them try and figure it out.
Interesting. So I assume these are like just regular ranchers, right? Not like mega rich people who own big ranches and they can afford to lose cattle. These are regular people some of them you've won over. Yeah.
Like I said, both.
Yeah. Okay.
There are ranchers that, fly helicopters back and forth to their land and stuff. So there are ranchers that have, it's a secondary to their real job someplace else.
But that's not necessary. Those aren't necessarily the only ranchers you've won over in your time.
No, there's it becomes a personal thing. The more time you spend with people, the more you get to know each other and trust each other and be able to have conversations about what's necessary.
Yeah.
And understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. And, I think that's also true for, believe it or not, wolves. In my conversation with Rick McIntyre, I mean, it's really clear that, and from my personal experience too, the more time you spend with wolves in the wild, watching them, the more your attitude changes about them in terms of how they behave and what your own personal fears and biases might be against wolves. Yeah, definitely changes how you look at it.
Yeah, learning about wolves, I think, ranchers, they're pretty much, they love the landscape, being outdoors. And so many of them are very interested in learning about wolves.
Yeah.
And, just the whole nature of wolves with their family ties and structure that's not that different than humans is very compelling to people once they learn about it.
Hey, there's a reason that domestic dogs descend from wolves, right? They are very, if you really start to look at it, wild wolves are very closely intertwined with human beings in terms of behavior and the way they work the landscape, right? Yeah, it's kind of cool. Okay, so the program's been pretty successful. What's the number you have to get to for Mexican wolves to be considered recovered?
The number is an average of 320 in the United States over 8 years.
Okay.
So that 319 that the program just hit for 2025 can start factoring into that average for a delisting. But it's also making sure that the genetic representation from the captive population has been put into the wild population.
Okay.
Because you can control who breeds in the captive population has a higher genetic diversity than the wild population, which breeds with, as they want.
Yeah, whoever they want to, right?
Yeah. So
just not coyotes.
So yeah, just not coyotes. The goal has been to try and get that genetic representation from the captive population into the wild.
Interesting. Okay.
And they've been doing that with fostering of pups more recently. I mean, to establish the whole population, it had to be packs. It had to be families of wolves that were put out in the wild to get that population started. And that was successful. And now they're more focused on putting pups, which are less than 14 days old, from these breeding facilities, and the ones that are of important genetic, their parents were bred specifically to maintain that genetic diversity. Those pups are then taken into the wild, and the smallest usually of the Mexican wolf staff, they go into the dens, and the wolves are afraid of people. So the parents, they run away. The small person goes into the den and pulls out the puppies that are in there, and they have to be within a few days of those 14-day or less pups that are coming from captivity. So they're all about the same size because they grow pretty quickly. So a few days can mean a pretty big difference in size. So then they make sure that they all smell the same. So you make them all kind of pee and rub stuff from the den on everybody so that they all smell the same.
That's incredible.
And they never put more than 8 back in. They might take some of those pups from the wild and take them back to captivity, but and they know when the female whelps because of her radio collar. It stops moving around as much, and so they know that she's gone into a den.
Interesting.
And so put the pups back in the den, and then leave, and then not long after, the mother will come back, and she's got very strong maternal instincts at that stage, right after, and that's why 14 days or less. Strong maternal instincts. She can't count, and so she just starts nursing those pups, and then they're raised as wild pups by those parents.
Fascinating. So this is so crazy. You're talking about, to maintain genetic diversity, sometimes you take puppies from a breeding facility and you time it just right with a wild female that's also just given birth, and you kind of swap out and intermix the puppies to keep things. Logistics of that sound incredible. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, it is. It's an exhausting, because it all happens. Wolves, like I said, they breed once a year, so they're pretty much breeding around Valentine's Day, really. But they gestate 63 days and then have their pups pretty close together. So if this is going to work, you're doing several animals, packs, within
like a week, for a few days.
Weeks.
Yeah, a few weeks. Okay, incredible.
Yeah, and so I think one of the larger numbers I remember in one year was 22 pups coming into some of these dens. But the important thing is that they now have, they've done it about at least 140 different pups into these dens now. And they have about 20 that have survived to breeding age. So it's not a huge number, but those are also just the ones that they have detected, because you can't put a radio collar on a little pup.
No, right.
But you can put microchips in them. So when you encounter them again, you know where they came from. And you also know their genetics from that blood draw.
Right.
So they know at least 20 have made it to 2 years, which is breeding age. And of those, there have been at least 20 litters of new pups in the wild based from these fosters.
That is so cool. That is just such an awesome story. And it kind of fits, because I know there's been some examples up in Yellowstone of one wolf, a female wolf, will raise the puppies of another wolf. If that other female has died, they'll actually adopt different wolves from a different mother. So yeah, that maternal instinct is very strong. And I assume pups have a fairly high mortality rate their first year.
They do. Yeah. It's about 50%. And what they're finding is that the fostered pups' mortality is just about the same as the regular pups in the wild. And, most species have, they often have about a 50%.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon.
Especially predators. Yeah. It's kind of a feast and famine type situation with them. So speaking of mortalities, in the wild or released now wild Mexican wolves, aside from what would be expected mortality of old age or encounters with other wolves, what's the number one cause of wolf mortality among the released wolves?
It would be human-caused mortality.
So that hasn't
Wolves
changed.
They do get shot. And there's been cases. There's one case of a rancher who killed a wolf with a shovel, and he did plead guilty, and he ended up losing his Forest Service grazing lease.
The leases we were talking about, yeah.
People have also shot wolves that are wearing radio collars, and they've also sometimes removed those collars. But it still becomes a difficult task to take those cases to court.
Yeah.
And it's because evidence is often scarce. Smaller animals, if you shoot them, the bullet goes on through often, and wolves are smaller, the Mexican wolves. So you don't have the bullet even. They're out in the middle of, nowhere. They're very remote.
Right.
And then, when you do get a case, it's difficult because you're taking it to a U.S. attorney who's also dealing with pornography, child abuse, all sorts of other pretty important issues also.
Exactly.
And so you're up against that plate of other stuff. And then, as you know, the other challenge is the McKittrick policy that says they have to have known that it was an endangered animal and it was a wolf. And so that's also a challenge. I think you've talked about that on some of your other podcasts.
Yeah. The McKittrick policy has come up before, and it is an anomaly that is causing a lot of problems with the prosecution of endangered species, not just wolves, but it has particularly impacted wolf investigations and prosecutions. Like you mentioned, some of these people are removing collars and trying to hide the collars or destroy the collars, which kind of is an indicator that they know they killed a wolf versus something else. Yeah. But here's some just anecdotal statistics from just talking to different people, and these are very informal, but there's an estimate among law enforcement people that between 2017 and 2017 and 2022, there were about 61 suspicious wolf mortalities. So they were suspected of being what we call illegal take, which is poaching, either a shooting or a trapping or something. Of those 61, only 2 of those cases were prosecuted. And that's a lot of that has to do with proof problems because they're difficult cases to make. And also McKittrick played a big role in a lot of that because they get what are called declinations from the U.S. Attorney's Office because the U.S. Attorney is basically nervous about going forward where there could be this defense raised by the defendant. And you bring up a great point. We've talked about this before in previous seasons, how the U.S. Attorney's offices are set up around the country. And these are remote areas where these wolves are released. So there's probably no environmental crimes unit. It's probably a smaller U.S. Attorney's office, and they do everything. So like you said, when the special agent comes in with a case, they're competing against bank robbers, child pornographers, smugglers, drug dealers, terrorists even, that the office has got conflicting. And, what are they going to go with? They're going to go with a higher profile case that maybe is easier to make. They're looking at an Endangered Species Act misdemeanor involving a wolf that's going to be very difficult to prove because of the Department of Justice's own constraints. So it must be really frustrating as a recovery coordinator, right?
Well, it was very frustrating for us and the staff. It's also very frustrating for the law enforcement. And these cases are not for lack of action by law enforcement and Fish and Wildlife Service. They really put a lot of effort into them. And even though they had very few that got convictions, they still would investigate and get out there as soon as they could. And it was always impressive, really.
Good. So you always had a good relationship between the recovery program and the law enforcement officers who were out there.
Yes. very much so.
Yeah, and the service, the agents that work in New Mexico and Arizona, regardless of where they are, they might be in Phoenix, they might be in Albuquerque. Every agent I know who has been assigned over the years to New Mexico or Arizona has worked a wolf case. They all kind of like it. It's all hands on deck when there's a suspicious wolf, and whoever's closest will handle it. Plus, currently, the service does have one dedicated agent who works, primarily his primary responsibility is to work on Mexican gray wolf cases. And he's based right there in Alpine. So that's good. You have somebody who can respond quickly.
Well, and that's another important part of we talked earlier about to get the animals recovered. And the other criteria that's in the recovery plan is that the states, Arizona, New Mexico, the White Mountain Apache tribe, who has a good population out there, and also Mexico, all need to have regulations in place that will ensure that human-caused mortality is not going to lead to the decline of the population. For delisting, there also has to be a population in Mexico.
Oh, really?
I want to make sure I brought that in, of 200 animals over 8 years with the same goals.
Okay.
And so that's been another key element to the recovery of the Mexican wolf.
Perfect, because this is exactly what I wanted to talk about next is, we talked about where we need to be to get recovery. And as a biologist who works for the Fish and Wildlife Service and spent her whole career working on endangered species issues, what's the goal of the Endangered Species Act? Is it to get animals on the list or off the list?
Off the list. That is recovery.
Exactly.
Recoveries are, getting animals off the list through recovery.
Yes, right.
So I have to put that in because there is a bill right now to delist the Mexican wolf before the House.
Yes.
But that would not be based on recovery.
Right. That's not based on science. That's based on politics.
Correct.
And boy, we could spend a whole episode talking about the myths that have infiltrated the political parties of this country regarding Mexican wolves and gray wolves in the north too. But you're right. So the goal of the service and the ESA is to get animals off once they are recovered, right? So once they meet that threshold, they can be delisted. And then, as you mentioned, properly managed by the states. Because we don't want to turn it back to the states and then have them allow depletion of the animals again, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has to come back and spend millions of dollars to save them again. We don't want that to happen. Yeah.
And we were really fortunate that the states and also the tribes around were very key to us putting together our recovery plan.
Great.
And so they're on board with where the recovery plan is going.
Very good.
And all that with the regulations as well.
It is neat that the White Mountain Apache Reservation's right there, because my understanding is they've taken a real strong interest in wolf recovery up there.
Yes. They've been really good partners.
That's awesome. And so that gives, they of course have their own law enforcement. They have tribal police, and then of course Arizona Game and Fish and New Mexico have their own state wildlife officers. Have they also been supportive of conducting investigations of illegal take?
Yes,
Great.
They have been.
Okay.
They partner with the law enforcement agents from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And Mexico as well has their own Endangered Species Act. It's I can't tell you the name of it right now off the top of my head, but so they also have, through their federal government, an Endangered Species Act in the listing of the Mexican wolf.
So what do you think? Are we headed in the right direction for Mexican gray wolf recovery?
Well, we are. I mean, you think about it, we started in 98 with 0 in the wild.
Right.
0 in the wild. And now we're up to 319 in the United States. And just in the last 2 months, they just released 2 families of wolves down into Mexico. I think one's still in a pre-release pen, but one is in the wild now. They released a pregnant female, and she's whelping, from what I understand right now. So that's great. And they're releasing a new area of Durango. So we're hopeful that that's going to be a positive step forward for Mexico, which has been a little more problematic at times with poisoning of animals. So
yeah, we were talking about that a little bit before we started recording today, and that there's not as many regulations on poisons and poison access in Mexico as there is in the U.S.
And a lot of it's illegal.
Right.
So so it's, I don't know what their restrictions are completely, but I know a lot of that poisoning is not even legal under their laws.
And of course, the really insidious thing about poisoning is you might not even be targeting wolves. You might be targeting some other species, and you kill whatever comes by. Yeah, we had another wolf case that we talked about earlier in the season that was a attempted wolf poisoning case, and it killed a whole lot of other animals in the process. Yeah. It's pretty depressing. Yeah. Like you mentioned, that Mexican release is a key component to recovery, right? Because there have to be wild wolves there too.
And Mexico's been a good partner over the years as well. Okay. We do a lot of meetings with Mexico, and Arizona Game and Fish as well does a lot of work down helping Mexican counterparts.
Very cool. So before we wrap up, we're almost out of time. As a resident in the Southwest, you live in Arizona currently, right? Or do you live in New Mexico? You're all over the place. You're all over the place, Sherry.
Both.
Okay, but the Southwest,
I like the Southwest.
As a longtime resident of the Southwest, what's your view on Mexican wolves? What's their place? Do they have a place? What do you think?
I think they're incredibly important. They're an apex predator, an iconic apex predator. They're important for maintaining the ecosystem, keystone species, making sure that the elk are not, degrading the ecosystems in the Southwest. And, there's also other arguments, that are really relevant. A lot of people find them spiritual. Mm-hmm. They'll see their first wolf in the wild, and it's the most impactful thing that's happened to them. And, and it's also just getting these animals back into the wild is correcting what humans did in the past by almost causing the extinction of the Mexican wolf, down to 5 animals. It's just it's important, I think, that we correct those things that we have done in the past that were wrong. The wolves are very recoverable. Mm-hmm. They're over-harvested. I mean, there's really 3 ways that, there's probably more, but 3 basic ways that animals become endangered from poisons, toxins like DDT in the environment, from over-harvesting, and then from loss and degradation of habitat. Mm-hmm. And the first 2, you can stop putting those toxic things into the wild, mm-hmm. Like DDT, we stopped that, and a lot of species recovered, peregrines and
eagles,
pelicans. And you can stop over harvesting too, whales and wolves. Mm-hmm. You can stop doing that and they will recover. Mm-hmm. The things that are harder, the species that are harder to recover are those where they've lost their habitat and you don't know where else to get it back, right. Or it's degraded to the point you have to restore it. And we're not smart enough. We're not that good at restoring habitats. There's so many components that we just don't really even know what they are.
Right.
And so we try hard, but we don't always make it.
Yeah.
So wolves are very recoverable.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great statement that people need to remember, is that it kind of fits with what I've always said, is that a role that law enforcement plays in recovery is that we mm-hmm. can sometimes give the animals the breathing room they need to make that, because we can help take away some of those pressures of the overharvest.
Yes.
It gives them just that enough breathing room to make that next leap to recovery, right? And it's human beings, that's all we really need to do,
Yeah.
So let me ask you this.
True.
What would you say to somebody, those are great, very valid reasons. What would you say to somebody who lives in Miami or New York City or downtown Seattle or downtown LA? Why should they care about Mexican gray wolves?
It's interesting. We get a lot of support from all over the country for the Mexican wolf and all over the world, because people, they feel that bond with wolves. Mm-hmm. And of course, people, out here will say, okay, well, go put them in Miami then, put them in their backyards. I get that a lot.
I know, I hear that a lot too.
but the reality is that people do still care about wolves. And that hearing that howl in the wild is pretty incredible to hear. And some people just want to know that howl in the wild is out there.
Exactly. You know, I have always said that about like tigers. I have never seen a tiger in the wild, and I'm pretty confident I never will. But it's really important to me to know that they're there. I don't know why. I want to know that there are tigers there. I could go see if I had the money, the time, and the luck. Yeah,
exactly right.
And you know, one last thing I'll say too on wolves, and then I'll let you have the last word, is that I consider, like you said, people that are out there, they see a wolf for the first time, they're kind of moved. For me, it wasn't seeing a wolf for the first time; it was hearing one. And I was hiking in the backcountry in Yellowstone. You know, you're out there, you're feeling vulnerable anyway, and then you hear this very deep howl that's very different than a coyote howl. And it just was, you know, it's one of those moments in your life where you remember every aspect of that moment, and it's just a reminder that, you know, you're part of the natural environment, and this is triggering something in you that's very primal, that goes back, you know, thousands of years in your DNA. And I kind of put it up there with other experiences, being on foot in Africa and encountering an elephant. That's a very moving experience too. I mean, not in a vehicle, but on foot. That's a very moving experience that'll change your life in a hurry. But it also gives you an incredible appreciation for the animal and the environment that animal needs and lives in, right? Anyway, so last word, Sherry, I'll give you the last word. What haven't I asked you, or what do you wish I would have asked you in this interview?
Well, you know, wolves, they get a lot of attention from a lot of different realms, politically, from the public and everything. You know, and a lot of species don't get any attention. You know, you think about some of our endangered isopods and plants and stuff. And
fairy shrimp.
I get it that they, you know, all of our endangered species need more resources to get to recovery. And a lot of them are simply forgotten almost, not by the biologists, but by the public. Right. So wolves get more attention than most others, and sometimes more than you want. It's nice to have the backing, but you know, it's a challenging program, and I just have so much respect for all the staff. A lot of them have been there a long time and been through bringing these wolves back into the wild. And you know, it's a great program. It's a challenging program because there is so much going on all the time, but it is also very rewarding to especially see that population growing in the wild. Perfect.
And you know, no doubt, the people like you and the people who worked with you put a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this program. And why? To help wolves recover, but really why is for the American people, which that's amazing. That's a huge thing that you do for us. And so thank you, Sherry, for everything you've done in that program and all the people that worked with you. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
100%. Thank you for being on the episode. Ladies and gentlemen, coming up next week, we are going to jump back into a law enforcement case, and we're going to talk about a law enforcement case involving a Mexican gray wolf. So thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Nature's Secret Service is written and produced by me, Ed Newcomer, and is co-produced by the DHTV team here at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Follow us on social media and connect with us online at naturesecretservice.com.